So, what's the craziest American questions you've received, either based off the presidency at the time? Because I know I've heard of or being patriotic and
Mm.
you guys are ruining the world. We love you guys. What's kind of the strangest things you've heard about Americans?
Um, I honestly kind of like the stereotypical things that you would assume. So like all the conversations I always had were about like guns, and then 2016, so it was Trump. So everyone was like, "Is he gonna win?" And I was like, at the time, I was like, I honestly don't know because like you would assume so, like because obviously any normal person like they could see through his bullshit, like just knew that like he's a fucking liar and like he's a terrible businessman. But if you're an idiot, obviously he's your messiah because obviously you're not smart enough to know any better.
Oh shit!
And so um
I could.
and then like the other thing was like um guns obviously, and then just kind of like the American like we're assholes because like, oh yeah, America, we have like freedom, so kind of like the patriotism side of things. So those are kind of like all the topics that people always wanted to cover, but it was never like not so much like negative, like where like, oh, like, you know, like you guys are this way, but like they wanted to understand like where the fuck does that like mentality come from, and like how is that like such a huge like component of like your political like the political system, and then just kind of how people like see things. And um you know, me constantly like just, you know, having all these different conversations like, and then having to actually like think about it. And so I was like, well, you know, like with like the gun thing, you know, obviously that all stems from us being a former British colony and like fighting off the British, um and then like kind of the military complex of, you know, just global conflicts. So I was like, you know, obviously there's a whole bunch of different factors that come into play um, with that. But then the other thing too, I was always saying is like with like lobbyists and so like the NRA, and so I was like, you know, like um, you know, with like political systems, everybody always, you know, thinks and says how it's like so corrupt, and like, you know, there's this viewpoint that like the American like political system is great, and I was like, not really. Like, I mean, the difference between like the U.S. and like South American countries is, you know, we have lobbyists in the U.S., but you know, if I was someone that had a shit ton of money and I wanted to buy influence in Mexico or Colombia or any country, like I could just go straight to the politician. Like there's no third party. It's like, yo, like I want cocaine legal. Like here's like I got like, you know, 50 million to like make. I want to make this shit happen. And you know, in the U.S., it's like, oh, we have a lobbyist. So then it's like, okay, like, well, you know, we're gonna talk to this guy, and then he's gonna talk to the senator that knows this senator and this senator and that senator. And so there really isn't that much of a separation between it. And so um, you know, like that's like one of the things I was always telling people is like it's really just kind of how the political system is built, that it allows that. The, you know, that's kind of the other thing as well. It's like, okay, well, like this you know, they're bringing up like mass shootings that constantly happen, and I was like, yeah, like, you know, it's really just kind of things are set up that, you know, it's relatively easy to prevent change from happening. and and then even then I was like, you know, like a lot of like the legislation that people are passing isn't that insane. It's, you know, just kind of common sense. It's like, okay, well, like if you're like a violent criminal that, you know, you're someone that like beats your wife or like gets into bar fights constantly, obviously you shouldn't have a gun because that makes you even more dangerous, you know, than you obviously normally are. And um, yeah, like, you know, like that was just kind of like the big conversation that I always had with people. But the other thing too, I was told like a lot of people that were always asking me that is I was like, yeah, like, um, you know, honestly, like if you go to the US, like go to a red state and then just shoot a bunch of guns, and then you'll understand like why it kind of is. Cause I was like, guns are fun as fuck. Like I've shot a bunch of guns. Like it really is like fun to just go to a gun range or like be out in the country and just like screw around. But obviously not everybody should have a gun, you know, based off of, you know, certain things. And so like that's what I was told them. I was just like, yeah, like, you know, it's one of those weird things where it's like, yeah, like I like playing like shooting guns and stuff, but obviously like, you know, like not everybody should be able to have access to them. And um yeah, you know, like it's just kind of like a lot of conversations like that, but it was never really yeah, like them like being like, accusatory, or like you're making a lot of accusations about things. Like they just honestly were like just curious, like how the hell, like why it is the way it is. And it was just like, I mean, honestly, it's a lot of different things, but
yeah, it's a kind of go back on the gun issue. It's like there's nothing better than shooting a gun, in my opinion. I mean, there's a lot of great things, but like it's Americana at its finest. And when the COVID thing happened, I'm like, I need a gun. I've never had a gun in my house. I was like, I need some guns. Like, fuck, I'm like, what's going on here?
But you know, not only that, it's like that takes us back, right? To early. I mean, even before guns, you know, we were throwing rocks and adults and throwing spears at animals. And, I mean, it's just
something about protection.
Right.
It's very compelling, and I do see the ridiculous side as well.
And being able to get food, right? You got to get fucking food, and I mean, that's what guns are, you know, typically used for. But
or oil to get oil lately. But it's interesting.
Shooting a gun's fun, man. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, I do like it too. You know, it is hella fun. But yeah, it's just another way to separate us, right?
Well, yeah, and it's like everything politics bleeds into, and it's kind of funny is because like I was just thinking as we were talking about getting asked these more questions, I was thinking about I traveled through the Bush years and the Obama years and slightly the Trump years, but not too much. But it's funny how Bush was just a point of conversation, even if they didn't know I was American. And I know there's a lot of American backpackers that have claimed to be Canadian. I have done the same just to avoid that bullshit because I don't like to be on the stand for America, especially when shit's so crazy here. But it also is great for every American to get a perspective of a bunch of people from different countries, is because one, they're outside of America, so they're safe to say what the fuck they want. They can say fuck America, whatever. And sometimes they're wrong. But what's great is that you realize there's always this left and right in America, but not everyone subscribes to that in the world because the U.S. is not the world, even though it seems like it a lot of times, and it has a huge influence. But the left and right, everything having to have that extreme issue, I found when I traveled that, yeah, there's certain people like that, but moreover, I found this like moderate, just sometimes I think left on this, sometimes I think right on this. I think gay people should get married. I think people should shoot guns if they want, or vice versa, or in a different way. But anyways, I think it's healthy to see, because we're as Americans, whether you're right or left, we're egomaniacs in the world sometimes. Is that still true? Is that kind of based any type of reality in your travels in the recent years?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, that's kind of like one of the other things that people always said to me, that they're like, oh, like you're like one of like the chillest Americans like I've ever like hung out with. And I was, what the hell does that mean? And then they're like, oh, well, you know, like sometimes you meet like people from the US and like total like dickheads, like kind of like, you know. And I was like, well, I mean, not everyone is like that. Like it's you know, like there's degrees of everything, but then even then too, like that's kind of the other thing you come to realize too, is like with like all the people that frequently travel, is that everybody obviously, like, you know, you don't agree on a lot of like, you know, there's different like issues, but for the most part, like you apply a lot of sense to like kind of just like everyday like issues and problems, and it's not really that like polarizing to someone that's like traveled a lot, because you're like, you've been to all these different countries and like you see how people like live and like how they go about their, you know, day-to-day lives, and so like there's a lot of like misconceptions that you have that go away from that experience. And so then obviously, you know, like, oh, that's not right, like, because like, you know, like you'll be in a hostel where someone says like, oh, you know, like you know, like they do this in like Colombia, and then you're like, no, like they don't fucking do that, like I've been there, like that doesn't happen at all, like, you know, where the fuck were you? And so then, you know, like you have all these other people that like have experiences that they can actually draw on and say like, no, I was there, like, you know, like I can like literally show you a photo of like how you're wrong, which it never really gets to that, but you know, like, you know, just everybody's like traveling, they're like, okay, well, I guess like I was just in some odd situation that, you know, is like an outlier, and so then yeah, like you just have a much bigger perspective on things, you know, from that, because you're constantly talking to other people that have been somewhere else. And like that was one of the other like conversations that like constantly did like all of like the kind of like American conversations I had with other travelers, was that, and like it all kind of went back to just how the US has their the U.S. like view on like life, and it's like, oh, like wait till the last minute to go do things, and it's like, well, like no, like that's part of the reason why I'm like, you know, like with like you know, politics in the States, it's always very like, you know, America's the greatest country in the world and like all this shit, and it's like, well, it's not. Like if you've been anywhere else, like we're not that much different. Like I'm in the UK, and I literally have the same access to everything. Well, I actually have free healthcare here, so like that's, you know, a huge yeah, I got that socialism that we don't want